I never thought our quiet suburban life in Phoenix, Arizona, would turn into a legal nightmare. But the moment my wife rolled into that HOA meeting last Tuesday, everything changed in ways I could never have predicted. My name is Thomas Zimmerman, and I had been living in the Sunnyside Ridge community for 3 years with my wife, Grace. She's the strongest person I know, even after the car accident 2 years ago left her paraplegic. Grace adapted to her wheelchair faster than anyone expected, never complaining, always pushing forward. We'd chosen this neighborhood specifically because the model home showed wide doorways and accessible features. What we didn't anticipate was the newly elected HOA board that took over 6 months ago, led by a woman named Patricia Henderson, who seemed to think the entire community existed solely for her personal aesthetic pleasure. The problem started small. First, it was a warning letter about Grace's wheelchair ramp we'd installed at our front entrance. According to Patricia, it didn't match the architectural harmony of the neighborhood. I'd followed every permit requirement from the city, had it painted to match our house trim, kept it minimal and tasteful. But Patricia wanted it gone, claiming it was an eyesore that decreased property values. I'd ignored the first 2 letters, thinking she'd eventually back off. Then came the fines. $50 a week for each week the ramp remained. I called an emergency meeting with the HOA board, trying to reason with them, explaining that the ramp was a medical necessity and that federal law protected our right to have it. Patricia had smiled coldly across the table and said we should have thought about that before buying in a premium community with standards. Grace had been furious when I told her, but she'd convinced me to attend the next full HOA meeting to address the issue publicly. She wanted to come with me, to show them that she wasn't some abstract concept they could legislate away, but a real person living in their neighborhood. I should have known it would go badly. The meeting was held at the community center on a humid evening in late June. The air conditioning struggled against the Arizona heat, and about 30 residents packed into the main room, sitting on folding chairs arranged in neat rows. Patricia sat at a table up front with the other board members, Vice President Brenda Morrison, Treasurer Kenneth Walsh, and Secretary Linda Carmichael. They looked official with their printed agendas and matching binders, like they were running a corporation instead of a neighborhood association. Grace and I arrived 10 minutes early, but the only remaining seats were in the back row. As Grace wheeled herself down the center aisle, I noticed several residents turning to stare. Patricia's eyes tracked Grace's movement with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between annoyance and disdain. We settled in, and I squeezed Grace's hand. She looked beautiful despite her obvious tension, her dark hair pulled back, wearing the blue blouse I'd bought her for her birthday. She squeezed back, giving me a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. Patricia called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. She worked through the agenda with mechanical efficiency. Landscape maintenance reports, proposed changes to parking regulations, complaints about residents leaving trash cans visible from the street. Every item received her full attention and elaborate commentary. When we finally reached homeowner concerns, nearly 45 minutes had passed. I raised my hand immediately. Patricia's gaze swept past me as if I were invisible. She called on Martha Reynolds instead, who wanted to discuss the community pool hours. Then James Hartford, concerned about suspicious vehicles in the neighborhood. Then Elizabeth Porter, complaining about her neighbor's wind chimes. I kept my hand raised. Grace shifted uncomfortably in her wheelchair beside me. Finally, after the 5th person, Patricia sighed dramatically. "Yes, Mr. Zimmerman. Make it brief, please. We have many items to cover." I stood, my heart pounding. My wife and I have been receiving fines regarding the wheelchair ramp at our property. I'd like to address this issue because I believe there's been a misunderstanding about our rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Patricia's expression hardened. There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Zimmerman. The Architectural Review Committee denied your modification request because it violates our community guidelines. The ramp is visible from the street and detracts from neighborhood aesthetics. It's a medical necessity, Grace said from beside me, her voice steady but loud enough to carry. I can't enter my own home without it. Patricia turned her attention fully to Grace for the first time, and what happened next would be seared into my memory forever. She looked Grace up and down with unconcealed contempt, her lip curling slightly. Perhaps you should have considered your limitations before purchasing a home in a community with standards, Patricia said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. Several people in the audience gasped. We can't have every homeowner making whatever modifications they want just because of personal circumstances. Where would it end? If we allowed your ramp, next someone would want to paint their house purple because they're colorblind. Brenda Morrison leaned forward, nodding enthusiastically. Exactly right. Rules exist for everyone, not just people who can follow them conveniently. I felt Grace tense beside me, but before either of us could respond, Kenneth Walsh chimed in. I agree with Patricia. These accessibility modifications are really just excuses to avoid following guidelines. My aunt uses a cane, and she manages just fine without special treatment. Linda Carmichael added, the problem with people in wheelchairs is they expect everyone else to accommodate them instead of finding solutions that work within existing structures. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The casual cruelty, the complete dismissal of Grace's basic rights, the comparison of her needs to ridiculous hypotheticals. Several residents looked uncomfortable, but nobody spoke up. Patricia continued, emboldened by her board's support. Furthermore, she said, shuffling through her papers, I've been reviewing our community guidelines, and I believe we need to address another issue while we're on this topic. Your wheelchair, Mrs. Zimmerman, has been leaving marks on the community center floor and on the pool deck during your visits. This constitutes property damage under Section 12 of our bylaws. Grace's face went pale. What are you talking about? I've been careful everywhere I go. Nevertheless, damage has occurred. I have photographs. Patricia held up her phone triumphantly. Black scuff marks on our newly refinished floors. We'll be adding those repair costs to your existing fines. The meeting devolved from there. Patricia refused to hear any more from us, speaking over Grace every time she tried to explain the law. When I pulled out my phone to reference the actual text of the ADA, Patricia threatened to have me removed for disrupting the meeting. The other board members sat there nodding along like synchronized puppets, occasionally adding their own dismissive comments about how everyone has problems and special treatment isn't equality. We left that meeting humiliated and furious. Grace cried in the car, not from weakness but from sheer rage at being treated like a second-class citizen in her own neighborhood. I'd never felt so powerless in my life. These people were supposed to be our neighbors, part of our community, yet they'd treated Grace like her disability was a personal affront to their property values. That night, I barely slept. Grace tossed and turned beside me, and I knew she wasn't sleeping either. By morning, I'd made a decision. If the HOA wanted to play hardball, we'd give them a fight they'd never forget. I spent my lunch break that Friday researching disability rights attorneys in Phoenix. The first two firms I called couldn't take the case due to scheduling conflicts. The third firm transferred me to a lawyer named David Hernandez, who specialized in HOA compliance and discrimination cases. I explained the situation, expecting sympathy but professional distance. Instead, David's response was immediate and intense. "They said what at a public meeting?" His voice was sharp with disbelief. "Mr. Zimmerman, do you have any recordings or witnesses?" "No recording, but about 30 residents heard everything, and the meeting minutes should reflect what was said." "Perfect. Don't delete any emails or letters from them. Document every interaction from now on. I want to meet with you and your wife this week if possible." We met David at his office in downtown Phoenix on Monday afternoon. He was in his mid-40s, with graying hair and an intensity that put me at ease immediately. His office walls were covered with framed certificates and photos of him at various disability rights events. This wasn't just a job for him. It was clearly personal. David listened to our full story, taking detailed notes. Grace had brought all the warning letters and fine notices, which he reviewed with growing satisfaction. "This is one of the most clear-cut HOA violations I've seen," he said finally. "HOAs don't get to override federal law, no matter what their guidelines say. The Fair Housing Act requires them to allow reasonable modifications for people with disabilities. A wheelchair ramp is textbook reasonable. The fact that they're fining you for it is bad enough, but the comments at the meeting," he shook his head. "That's disability discrimination, harassment, and violation of your civil rights." "Can we make them stop the fines?" Grace asked. "We can do much more than that. We're going to file a federal lawsuit against the HOA, the board members personally, and the property management company if there is one. We'll seek an injunction stopping the fines immediately, compensatory damages for the discrimination and emotional distress, punitive damages to send a message, and attorney's fees. Plus, we'll file a complaint with HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development." The scope of what David was proposing stunned me. Is all that really necessary? We just want to keep our ramp and be left alone. David leaned forward, his expression serious. "Mr. Zimmerman, Grace, I need you to understand something. What happened to you wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. If we don't hold them accountable, they'll do this to someone else. Maybe someone without the resources to fight back. This HOA board needs to learn that disability rights aren't negotiable." Grace reached for my hand, squeezing tight. "Let's do it," she said firmly. "All of it." We spent the next 2 hours going through everything in detail. David explained the legal process, what to expect, and how long it might take. He estimated 6 months to a year for a full resolution, possibly longer if it went to trial. He worked on contingency, meaning he'd only get paid if we won, taking a percentage of any settlement or award. Given the strength of our case, he was confident over the next 2 weeks. David worked fast. He filed a federal lawsuit in the United States District Court for the District of Arizona, naming the Sunnyside Ridge HOA, Patricia Henderson, Brenda Morrison, Kenneth Walsh, Linda Carmichael, and the Desert Property Management Group as defendants. The complaint laid out everything: the ramp denial, the fines, the meeting comments, and the scuff mark accusations. It included charges of violating the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and various Arizona state laws regarding discrimination. He also filed for a preliminary injunction to immediately stop the fines and any other adverse actions against us. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. When the HOA received the lawsuit papers, all hell broke loose. Patricia called me directly, her voice shaking with rage. "How dare you sue us? We're your neighbors, your community. This is how you repay everyone who works hard to maintain property values. You mocked my wife's disability at a public meeting and illegally fined us for a federally protected modification," I said calmly. "This isn't about property values. This is about basic human decency and the law." "We'll fight this," Patricia hissed. "We'll countersue you for legal fees and defamation. You'll regret this." She hung up before I could respond. David had warned me they'd likely lash out, and he'd been right. The HOA hired a law firm, Sanderson and White, a mid-sized firm in Scottsdale that apparently specialized in HOA defense. Their lead attorney, Gregory Sanderson, immediately filed a motion to dismiss the case, arguing that the HOA had simply been enforcing its legitimate rules, and that any comments at the meeting were protected speech. David filed a response that systematically destroyed each argument. The Fair Housing Act explicitly overrode HOA rules when it came to disability accommodations. Speech could constitute harassment and discrimination when it created a hostile housing environment. He attached transcripts of the meeting minutes, which Patricia herself had filed with the county as required by Arizona HOA law. Every terrible comment was there in black and white, officially recorded. The preliminary injunction hearing arrived on a Tuesday morning in late July. The courthouse was downtown, a modern building with high security. Grace and I arrived early, David meeting us in the hallway outside the courtroom. He looked confident in his navy suit, carrying a thick briefcase full of documents. "Remember, you probably won't testify today," he said. "This hearing is mostly legal arguments, but the judge might ask you questions directly, so be ready. Just answer honestly and simply." The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected from TV shows, with maybe 50 seats for spectators. Patricia and the other board members sat on the opposite side with their attorney. Patricia wore a beige pantsuit and had her hair in a severe bun. She kept shooting angry glances our way. Gregory Sanderson was a stocky man in his 50s with a booming voice that filled the courtroom even when he was just talking to his clients. Judge Rachel Morrison entered, and we all stood. She was a black woman in her early 60s with close-cropped gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. David had told us she had a reputation for being fair but tough, with no patience for legal nonsense from either side. The hearing began with David presenting our case. He walked the judge through the timeline, showed photos of our simple, tasteful ramp, and read excerpts from the meeting minutes. When he got to Patricia's comments about Grace's limitations and the board members' statements about special treatment, Judge Morrison's expression darkened. "Do the defendants dispute that these statements were made?" she asked. Gregory Sanderson stood. "Your Honor, while the statements may sound harsh out of context, they were made during a legitimate board discussion about maintaining community standards. The HOA has rules that apply to everyone equally." "Mr. Sanderson," Judge Morrison interrupted, "the Fair Housing Act requires HOAs to make reasonable accommodations for residents with disabilities. A wheelchair ramp is clearly reasonable. What's your legal argument for why these fines are justified?" Sanderson launched into an explanation about architectural review processes and how the Zimmermans hadn't followed proper procedures. Judge Morrison let him talk for maybe 2 minutes before cutting him off again. "But they did follow city permit procedures, correct? And they did request approval from the HOA, which was denied solely based on aesthetics." "Yes, but Your Honor, aesthetics are a legitimate concern for property values, not when they violate federal anti-discrimination law, Mr. Sanderson. I've read your brief, and I'm frankly surprised you filed a motion to dismiss on this record. The meeting minutes alone establish a prima facie case of disability discrimination." I felt Grace relax slightly beside me. Judge Morrison turned to us, her expression softening. "Mrs. Zimmerman, how long have you been dealing with these fines?" Grace straightened in her wheelchair. "4 months, Your Honor. They've charged us $50 a week, so $200 a month. $800 total so far." "And has the HOA taken any other actions against you?" "They've threatened to place a lien on our house if we don't pay. And they said I'm damaging community property just by using my wheelchair normally." Judge Morrison's jaw tightened. She looked back at Sanderson. "Is your client seriously claiming that wheelchair use constitutes property damage?" To his credit, Sanderson looked uncomfortable. "Your Honor, there were photographs of scuff marks that could come from any number of sources, I imagine. This is getting worse by the minute, Mr. Sanderson." She flipped through some papers, then looked up decisively. "Here's my ruling. The plaintiff's motion for a preliminary injunction is granted. The HOA is immediately enjoined from collecting any fines related to the wheelchair ramp, from taking any action to remove the ramp, from placing liens on the Zimmerman's property for these fines, and from any further harassment regarding Mrs. Zimmerman's wheelchair use. The $800 in fines already collected will be refunded within 14 days. Patricia made a strangled sound of protest. Judge Morrison's gaze snapped to her. "Madam, I strongly suggest you remain quiet in my courtroom. I'm also ordering both parties to mediation within 30 days to see if this case can be resolved without a full trial. However, I'll note for the record that the plaintiffs have an exceptionally strong case, and I'd advise the defendants to consider that carefully during mediation." She banged her gavel and it was over. David was grinning as we left the courtroom. Patricia and her board members clustered with Sanderson in the hallway, their voices low and angry. As we passed, Patricia called out loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You're destroying this neighborhood. Everyone will pay higher fees because of your selfish lawsuit." David turned smoothly. "Mrs. Henderson, I'd recommend you stop speaking to my clients. Any further harassment will be added to our complaint." We got on the elevator before she could respond. In the parking garage, David shook both our hands enthusiastically. "That went even better than I hoped. Judge Morrison clearly sees this for what it is: blatant discrimination. The mediation is a formality, but it'll give them a chance to settle before this gets more expensive for them." "What do you think they'll offer?" I asked. "If they're smart. Full dismissal of all fines, a policy change to allow reasonable disability accommodations, mandatory training on disability rights for all board members, and probably 50 to 100,000 in damages. If they're stubborn, we go to trial and ask for much more." The number shocked me. I'd been thinking maybe they'd just apologize and leave us alone. David saw my expression and nodded. "This isn't just about making you whole, Thomas. It's about punishing behavior so egregious that it needs to be deterred. What they did to Grace was cruel and illegal. They need to pay for that, literally." Grace was quiet on the drive home. When we pulled into our driveway, she finally spoke. "You think I'm being vindictive?" "Patricia said we're hurting the neighborhood." I turned to face her fully. "Honey, you're holding people accountable for breaking the law and treating you terribly. That's not vindictive. That's justice. And if the HOA has to pay damages, that's a consequence of their own choices, not yours." She nodded slowly, but I could tell she was still processing everything. The truth was, neither of us were litigious people by nature. We'd never sued anyone before, never been involved in anything like this. But David was right. If we let this go, the HOA would keep abusing other vulnerable residents. The next week brought a new development. Several neighbors started approaching us, quietly expressing support. Martha Reynolds, who'd been at the meeting, stopped by with a casserole and an apology. "I should have spoken up that night," she said, standing awkwardly on our porch. "What Patricia said to Grace was horrible, and I just sat there. I'm sorry." Grace invited her in for coffee, and Martha explained that Patricia had been steadily antagonizing residents for months. She'd fined people for trivial violations, denied reasonable requests for modifications, and created a general atmosphere of fear. People were afraid to push back because Patricia controlled the board, and her husband was a real estate attorney who'd threatened several residents with legal action for various complaints. "Wait," I said. "Her husband is a lawyer. Is he advising her on this HOA stuff?" Martha nodded. "Richard Henderson. He doesn't specialize in HOA law, but Patricia's been telling everyone he says she's right about everything." I called David immediately after Martha left. He was very interested in this information. If her husband has been giving legal advice to the board, that could complicate things. It might explain why they've been so confident despite having no legal ground to stand on. Let me dig into this. The mediation was scheduled for mid-August at a neutral location, a conference room in a lawyer's office complex. Both sides arrived with their attorneys. Patricia looked like she'd aged 5 years in a month, her face drawn and tense. The other board members seemed subdued, no longer projecting the arrogant confidence from the meeting. The mediator was a retired judge named Harold Preston, a grandfatherly man with white hair and a calm demeanor. He explained the process. Each side would present their position, then he'd work with us separately to find common ground. The goal was settlement without trial. David presented our side first, laying out the legal violations and the damages we were seeking. In addition to compensation for the discrimination and emotional distress, we wanted policy changes and mandatory training. Then, Sanderson presented the HOA's position, which had shifted dramatically from his initial motion to dismiss. He acknowledged that mistakes had been made and that the board had acted on incomplete information about disability law. He offered to drop all fines, formally approve the ramp, and issue a written apology. "That's a start," David said mildly. "But it doesn't address the damages for the discrimination, nor does it prevent this from happening to someone else." We broke into separate rooms for caucusing. David laid out the situation bluntly. "They're scared. The apology offer shows they know they're going to lose badly if this goes to trial, but they're lowballing because they hope you'll just want this over with. We need to push for real money and real changes." "What should we ask for?" Grace said. "I think we go in at $200,000 in damages, full policy revision with my input, mandatory training for current and future board members, and your attorney's fees. They'll negotiate down from there, but I think we can settle around $120 to $150. The mediation dragged on for 6 hours. We went back and forth, with Preston shuffling between rooms. The HOA kept incrementally increasing their offer, first $20,000, then $40,000, then $60,000. Each time David held firm. By late afternoon, they were at $90,000 plus the policy changes and training. "I recommend we take it," David said. "We could probably get more at trial, but trials are unpredictable, and this gives you everything substantive you wanted. They're also covering all attorneys' fees separately, which is huge." Grace and I talked it over privately. The money was more than we'd ever expected. The policy changes meant other residents with disabilities would be protected. The training might actually educate Patricia and her cronies, though I doubted it. But there was one thing bothering me. "Do they have to admit wrongdoing?" I asked David. He hesitated. "Most settlements include no admission of liability. It's standard." "Why?" "Because if they don't admit they were wrong, they'll just tell everyone we blackmailed them or something. They'll be the victims in their version of events." David considered this. "I can ask, but it's unusual. They might walk away from the deal over that. Try, Grace said firmly. I want them on record admitting what they did was wrong. David went back to Preston with our counteroffer. $110,000, policy changes, training, attorney's fees, and a written admission that the HOA violated our rights under federal and state disability laws. Preston was gone for almost 30 minutes. When he returned, he was smiling slightly. They've agreed to everything except the admission. They'll acknowledge that their actions were inconsistent with federal disability law and that they should have approved your ramp. Is that acceptable? It wasn't everything, but it was close enough. We shook on the deal that evening, exhausted but victorious. The settlement would be drafted and signed within 2 weeks, with payment due within 30 days of signing. When we got home, I felt a strange emptiness. We'd won, but it didn't feel like the triumph I'd expected. Grace seemed to sense my mood. "What's wrong?" she asked as we got ready for bed. "I keep thinking about Patricia. She's going to go right back to being terrible to people, just more carefully. The training will be a joke. She'll find new ways to make residents miserable." Grace was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe, but we did what we could. We stood up for ourselves and we changed the rules to protect other people. That's not nothing." She was right, of course. We couldn't control Patricia's future behavior, only our response to what she'd already done. The settlement was signed in early September. The check arrived by courier 2 weeks later, along with the official policy revisions and a schedule for the board training sessions. David reviewed everything and confirmed it was all according to our agreement, but the story didn't end there. In late September, something unexpected happened. I was mowing our front lawn when Martha Reynolds hurried over, waving her phone excitedly. "Thomas, have you seen the neighborhood Facebook group?" I hadn't. I'd left the group months ago after seeing too many posts supporting Patricia's tyrannical approach to HOA management. Martha showed me her phone screen. There was a post from James Hartford, the guy who'd spoken at the meeting about suspicious vehicles. The post read, "I've been reviewing HOA financial records, as is my right under Arizona law, and I've discovered serious discrepancies. Over $40,000 in HOA funds are unaccounted for over the past year. I've reported this to the board and demanded an audit. If anyone else wants to join this effort, please contact me directly." My stomach dropped. Holy shit. "There's more," Martha said, scrolling through dozens of comments. "Other people have been coming forward with similar concerns. Kenneth Walsh apparently approved multiple landscaping contracts with his brother-in-law's company at inflated prices. And someone found out that Patricia used HOA funds to pay for repairs to her personal property, claiming they were community expenses." Within days, the situation exploded. James Hartford organized a group of residents to demand a full forensic audit. The property management company, already nervous from our lawsuit, quickly distanced themselves from the board's financial decisions. A special meeting was called for early October to address the allegations. Grace and I attended, curious to see how this would unfold. The community center was packed with angry residents. Patricia tried to call the meeting to order, but she was immediately shouted down. James Hartford stood and presented his findings, backed by documentation. The numbers were damning: personal purchases charged to HOA accounts, inflated contracts with family members, consulting fees paid to Patricia's husband Richard for legal advice that should have been covered by the HOA's attorney retainer. "This is embezzlement," James said flatly. "And I've already contacted the Arizona Attorney General's office." The room erupted. Residents who'd stayed silent during our discrimination battle now found their voices, furious about stolen money. Patricia tried to defend herself, claiming everything was legitimate and approved, but Brenda Morrison suddenly spoke up. "I never approved half these expenses," Brenda said, her voice shaking. "Patricia told me they were pre-approved by the management company. I just signed where she told me to sign." Kenneth Walsh and Linda Carmichael quickly echoed similar statements, clearly trying to save themselves. Patricia's face went red, then white. She started to respond but seemed to realize anything she said would only make things worse. The meeting ended with the board's immediate suspension and a vote to bring in an independent management company to conduct the audit and run the HOA temporarily. Every hand in the room went up in favor except Patricia's and a few of her close friends. David called me the next morning. "Have you heard about the HOA board?" I was at the meeting. "It's insane. It's also very relevant to our case. Embezzlement adds a criminal dimension to everything. The Attorney General's office will likely investigate, and depending on what they find, criminal charges could follow. I've already drafted an addendum to our settlement, noting that the terms remain in effect regardless of any board changes or criminal proceedings." The forensic audit took 6 weeks. Its findings were devastating. Over $60,000 had been misappropriated over 18 months. Patricia had charged personal expenses, including home repairs, landscaping, and even a vacation to her HOA credit card. Kenneth Walsh's brother-in-law had overbilled by nearly $20,000 across multiple contracts. Richard Henderson had been paid $15,000 in consulting fees, despite the HOA already having a lawyer on retainer, and there was no documentation of what he'd actually done to earn the money. In late November, the Arizona Attorney General filed criminal charges. Patricia Henderson was charged with theft, fraud, and misuse of HOA funds. Kenneth Walsh was charged as an accessory. Richard Henderson was charged with fraud related to the fake consulting fees. Brenda Morrison and Linda Carmichael were granted immunity in exchange for their testimony. As investigators determined, they'd been manipulated rather than actively participating in the scheme. The criminal trial was scheduled for the following spring, but Patricia's lawyer negotiated a plea deal in January. She pled guilty to reduced charges in exchange for full restitution of the stolen funds, 3 years probation, 500 hours of community service, and a permanent ban from serving on any HOA board in Arizona. Kenneth Walsh took a similar deal. Richard Henderson fought the charges initially, but eventually accepted a plea deal that included a reprimand from the State Bar of Arizona and a hefty fine. Throughout all of this, our settlement remained intact. The new interim HOA board honored every term, implemented the policy changes, and completed the training sessions with a much more receptive attitude than Patricia's board would have had. Several residents approached us to apologize for not speaking up during the meeting, and the neighborhood's atmosphere improved dramatically. Grace and I used part of the settlement money to make additional accessibility improvements to our home: a roll-in shower, wider hallways, and other features that made daily life easier. We donated $20,000 to a local disability rights organization that David recommended. The rest went into savings and investments, a security cushion we'd never had before. In March, we attended a community meeting to elect a new permanent HOA board. The candidates were all people we knew and respected, residents who'd stood up against Patricia's corruption. Martha Reynolds was elected president, promising transparency and common-sense leadership. One of her first acts was to formally apologize to us on behalf of the community. "What Patricia did to you was wrong on every level," Martha said at the podium, looking directly at Grace and me. This board will ensure that every resident is treated with respect and dignity, regardless of ability, race, age, or any other characteristic. We're here to maintain our community, not to bully our neighbors." The room erupted in applause. Grace squeezed my hand, tears in her eyes. It wasn't just about vindication anymore. The community had genuinely changed, learned something important from the whole ordeal. That spring, something else unexpected happened. David called with news that a local news station wanted to do a story about our case. Apparently, disability discrimination by HOAs was a bigger issue than most people realized, and our successful lawsuit had caught the attention of advocacy groups. Grace and I talked it over and agreed to the interview. The reporter, Angela Chen, was professional and empathetic. She interviewed us in our home, filmed Grace using her ramp, and spoke with David about the legal issues involved. The story aired in April during Sweeps Week, and the response was overwhelming. We received dozens of emails and messages from people sharing their own stories of HOA discrimination and abuse. Some were disability-related. Others involved discrimination based on race, family status, or religion. David forwarded several cases to attorneys he knew who specialized in those areas. Our story had inadvertently become part of a larger conversation about HOA accountability and the need for stronger oversight. The Arizona State Legislature even took notice. A representative from our district contacted us about testifying in favor of proposed legislation that would strengthen protections for residents with disabilities and increase transparency requirements for HOA boards. We testified in May, sharing our experience with the legislature's Housing Committee. The bill passed both chambers with strong bipartisan support and was signed into law in June. Patricia's criminal case concluded that same month with her sentencing hearing. Grace and I attended, wanting to see it through to the end. Patricia looked diminished in the courtroom, wearing a simple gray dress instead of her usual power suits. She gave a brief statement expressing regret for her actions and apologizing to the community. The judge was unimpressed. "Mrs. Henderson, you were elected to a position of trust, and you abused that trust systematically and deliberately. You stole from your neighbors, you discriminated against residents with disabilities, and you used your position to enrich yourself and your family. The fact that you've agreed to make restitution doesn't erase the harm you've caused." He sentenced her to the full 3 years probation with strict conditions, including monthly meetings with a probation officer and random audits of her finances. If she violated any terms, she'd serve 18 months in jail. Kenneth Walsh received a similar sentence. Richard Henderson's punishment was primarily professional. The state bar reprimand would follow him for years, damaging his reputation and career. As we left the courthouse, a reporter asked how we felt about the outcome. Grace answered before I could. "I feel like justice was served," she said simply. "Not just for us, but for everyone who's been bullied or discriminated against by people in power who think they're above the law. I hope this sends a message that disability rights matter and that there are consequences for violating them." The reporter asked a follow-up question about whether we'd forgiven Patricia. Grace paused, considering carefully. "Forgiveness is personal and complicated," she said finally. "I don't hate her, if that's what you're asking. But I also won't forget what she did or how she made me feel. She has to live with her choices, just like everyone else." That summer marked 2 years since the nightmare had started with that first warning letter about our ramp. Life had returned to a comfortable routine, but we were different people than we'd been before. Grace was more confident, more willing to speak up when she encountered accessibility issues or subtle discrimination. I'd learned that sometimes you have to fight, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when basic rights are at stake. The new HOA board was functioning smoothly under Martha's leadership. They'd implemented an online portal for submitting requests and complaints, making the process transparent and accountable. Residents could see the status of their requests and the board's reasoning for any decisions. It was night and day compared to Patricia's secretive, autocratic approach. In August, we received an invitation to speak at a National Disability Rights Conference in Washington, D.C. The organizers had heard about our case and wanted us to share our story with advocates from across the country. We accepted, and the trip was incredible. We met people doing amazing work, fighting battles similar to ours in different contexts. Grace connected with other wheelchair users who'd faced discrimination, and those conversations seemed to energize her in ways I hadn't expected. On our last night in D.C., we had dinner with David, who'd flown in to present at a different panel. Over wine and good food, we reflected on everything that had happened. "You know what still amazes me," David said. "If Patricia had just approved your ramp from the beginning, none of this would have happened. She'd still be running the HOA, still stealing money, still making people miserable. Your case brought everything crashing down." "Karma," Grace said with a slight smile. "Or maybe just proof that bad people usually make multiple kinds of bad choices." "Either way," I added, "I'm glad it's over, though I never want to be involved in a lawsuit again as long as I live." David laughed. "That's what everyone says, but you did good, both of you. You changed your community for the better, helped pass state legislation, and probably inspired dozens of other people to stand up for themselves. That's not nothing." He was right, though it was still strange to think of ourselves as activists or advocates. We just wanted to live peacefully in our home with basic dignity. The fact that we'd had to fight so hard for something so fundamental was a depressing commentary on how far society still had to go on disability rights. But we'd won. Not just the lawsuit, not just the money, but something more important: the principle that disability discrimination wouldn't be tolerated, that HOAs couldn't override federal law, and that people like Patricia would face real consequences for their cruelty and corruption. Back in Phoenix, life continued its new normal. Grace started volunteering with a local disability advocacy group, using our experience to help others navigate similar situations. I went back to focusing on my work as an accountant, though I developed a specialty in forensic accounting for HOAs after everything we'd been through. Several communities hired me to review their books and ensure proper oversight, word having spread about the Sunnyside Ridge scandal. One afternoon in October, almost a year after the settlement, I came home from work to find Grace in the backyard, working in the raised garden beds we'd installed. She was humming to herself, happy and relaxed. The Arizona heat had broken and the evening was perfect. "Good day?" I asked, sitting on the patio beside her wheelchair. "Great day." I helped a woman in Tucson file a complaint against her HOA for denying her request for a service dog. Totally straightforward case, but she was terrified to push back. Reminded me of us a year ago. Think she'll win? Definitely. She has good documentation, and the law is crystal clear. She just needed someone to tell her she wasn't crazy for thinking she was being treated unfairly. I watched her work, marveling at how much strength she'd found through this whole ordeal. The discrimination and mockery that could have broken her had instead forged her into someone even stronger, someone who used her experience to help others. That evening, we got an unexpected visitor. Kenneth Walsh knocked on our door, looking nervous and uncomfortable. I almost didn't let him in, but Grace said we should hear what he had to say. He stood in our living room, clearly struggling with what he wanted to express. "I wanted to apologize," he said finally, "for everything at the meeting, for the things I said about your wheelchair. I was wrong and I'm sorry." Grace studied him for a long moment. "Why are you apologizing now? You had plenty of chances before." "Because I've been in court-ordered therapy as part of my probation," Kenneth admitted. "And my therapist made me confront the fact that I've spent my life going along with bullies like Patricia because it was easier than standing up for what's right. I hurt people because I was a coward. That includes both of you." It was more honesty than I'd expected from him. Grace's expression softened slightly. "I appreciate you saying that," she said. "I'm not sure if I forgive you yet, but I appreciate it." Kenneth nodded, seeming to understand that was all he could expect. "I also wanted you to know that I'm selling my house and moving out of state. Fresh start somewhere nobody knows about all of this. But before I left, I needed to say I'm sorry." After he left, Grace and I talked for a long time about forgiveness and accountability. Some people, like Patricia, would probably never truly acknowledge the harm they'd caused beyond what was legally required. Others, like Kenneth, might eventually understand and try to make amends, even if imperfectly. And some, like Brenda and Linda, had been followers who'd learned a hard lesson about complicity. As fall turned to winter, we celebrated the holidays with a neighborhood party that Martha organized. The community center was decorated festively, and nearly every resident attended. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, so different from the tense, fearful environment under Patricia's rule. During the party, a new resident approached us, a young veteran named Michael Torres, who used a prosthetic leg. He thanked us for what we'd done. "I almost didn't buy here because I was worried about HOA issues," he said. "But my realtor told me about your case and how the community changed. She said this was one of the most disability-friendly neighborhoods in Phoenix now. That's because of you guys." Those words meant more than the settlement money ever could. We'd actually changed something, made a difference that would help people we'd never meet. The ramp that had started everything was just a piece of wood and metal, but it had become a symbol of something larger: the right to live with dignity, to have your needs recognized and accommodated, to be treated as a full member of your community. In January, we received notice that Patricia had completed her community service and was living in Prescott, a small city in northern Arizona. She'd apparently gotten a job as an office manager, a significant step down from the real estate career she'd had before. I felt no particular satisfaction in her downfall, but I didn't feel sorry for her either. She'd made her choices and faced the consequences. The new year brought more speaking invitations, more opportunities to share our story. Grace became increasingly comfortable in the role of advocate, though she always emphasized she hadn't wanted to be one circumstances had thrust it upon her. Still, she embraced it, finding purpose in helping others navigate the complex intersection of disability rights and housing law. By the spring, 3 years after we'd bought our house in Sunnyside Ridge, the community was thriving under new leadership. Property values had actually increased, ironically disproving Patricia's claim that our ramp would hurt them. The neighborhood had earned a reputation as welcoming and well-managed, attracting buyers who valued community over conformity. We'd settled into a good life. Our home was fully accessible and comfortable. Our neighbors were friends rather than adversaries. The HOA functioned as it was supposed to, maintaining common areas and resolving disputes fairly, not wielding power arbitrarily. And we discovered a sense of purpose in advocacy work that neither of us had anticipated. One warm April evening, Grace and I sat on our back patio watching the sunset paint the desert sky in brilliant oranges and purples. We'd been through so much together: her accident, her recovery, the discrimination, the lawsuit, the media attention, the advocacy work. All of it had tested us and ultimately strengthened both our relationship and our characters. "You ever regret buying this house?" I asked, half joking. Grace laughed. "God, yes. Sometimes I think about how much easier life would have been if we just found a different neighborhood. But then I think about all the people we've helped, the legislation we helped pass, the community improvements. Would I trade all that to avoid the pain? I honestly don't know." "Me neither," I admitted. "I hate what Patricia and her board put you through. But I'm proud of how we fought back, how we didn't just let them get away with it. And we made them pay," Grace added with a satisfied smile. "Literally and figuratively." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, holding hands and enjoying the evening. Our journey had been difficult and painful, but we'd emerged stronger. We'd learned that standing up for your rights isn't easy, that fighting discrimination requires courage and resources and support. We'd learned that communities can change for the better when good people refuse to stay silent. And we'd learned that, while the law doesn't always protect the vulnerable, when it does work, it can be powerful. The ramp at our front door remained where it had always been, no longer a source of conflict, but simply a necessary part of our home. Sometimes I'd notice new residents or visitors looking at it, and I'd wonder if they knew the story behind it. Probably not most of them, and that was okay. It was just a ramp now, serving its purpose without drama. But every time I saw Grace roll up that ramp into our house, I remembered everything it represented: the cruelty we'd faced, the fight we'd waged, the justice we'd won, and the change we'd created. Patricia Henderson had thought she could mock my wife's wheelchair and bully us into submission. Instead, she'd awakened something fierce in both of us, and that awakening had destroyed her board, exposed her crimes, and transformed our entire community. In the end, the story wasn't really about an HOA or a lawsuit or even a wheelchair ramp. It was about dignity, about refusing to accept discrimination, about holding powerful people accountable when they abuse that power. It was about ordinary people finding extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded it. And it was about my love for Grace, her love for herself and her own worth, our shared love for the idea that everyone deserves to live without fear or shame or discrimination. That love had been tested by fire, and it had emerged refined and strengthened. As darkness fell and stars began appearing in the desert sky, we went inside our home, rolling over the threshold that had caused so much trouble and ultimately so much change. Behind us, the neighborhood settled into evening quiet, peaceful and content under new leadership. Ahead of us lay whatever challenges life would bring next, but we'd face them together, stronger and wiser for everything we'd survived. The lawsuit had destroyed Patricia's board, but it had built something better in its place: a real community, where every resident truly belonged. And that, more than any settlement or verdict, was the victory worth celebrating.